The morning session moved quickly, with Judge Whitman handling each case with her trademark efficiency. When Denise Robinson's case was finally called at 2:45 p.m., most of the courtroom had cleared out, leaving only a few stragglers on the wooden benches. Case number 2024 TR 789, the State versus Denise Robinson, the court clerk announced. Denise rose from her seat in the back row. She was dressed simply but neatly in a navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in a professional bun. As she walked to the defendant's table, her posture remained straight, her head held high. Unlike most defendants who appeared before Judge Whitman, she showed no signs of nervousness. "Ms. Robinson," Judge Whitman began, looking down at the file, "you're here for an unpaid traffic citation from 3 months ago. The original fine was $300, which has now accumulated late fees, bringing the total to $450. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Denise spoke clearly, her voice steady. "I acknowledge the violation, but I would like to explain the circumstances that prevented me from paying the fine on time." Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly. In her experience, explanations were usually just excuses dressed up in fancy words. "Ms. Robinson, the court is only interested in whether you accept responsibility for the violation and your failure to pay the fine within the designated period." "I do accept responsibility," Denise responded, maintaining eye contact with the judge. "But I believe context matters, Your Honor. The money for the fine was set aside, but there was an emergency in our community." "Ms. Robinson," Judge Whitman interrupted, her tone sharp. "The court's time is valuable. A payment deadline is not a suggestion. It is a legal requirement." Something flickered in Denise's eyes, not fear, but a quiet determination. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm not trying to waste the court's time. I'm trying to show that sometimes people face impossible choices." "That's enough." Judge Whitman cut in again, her patience wearing thin. "Your attempts to justify your noncompliance are bordering on contempt of court." The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even Thomas, the clerk, looked up from his computer with concern. There was something different about this defendant, something that made the judge's usual harsh approach feel somehow wrong. But Denise wasn't finished. "Your Honor, if you would allow me just 1 minute to explain." "Ms. Robinson," Judge Whitman's voice echoed through the courtroom, "I find your continued disruption of these proceedings unacceptable. In addition to the original fine and late fees, I am imposing a $500 contempt of court fine. Total amount due is now $950, to be paid within 30 days. A murmur ran through the few remaining spectators. The fine was unusually harsh, even by Judge Whitman's standards. Denise stood silently for a moment, her expression unchanged. Then, very calmly, she spoke. "Your Honor, I will pay the fine. But I want the record to show that this system continues to punish people who are trying to do the right thing, both for themselves and their community." Judge Whitman felt a flicker of unease at these words, but she pushed it aside. "Your political statements are not relevant to these proceedings, Ms. Robinson. You have 30 days to pay the full amount. Next case." As Denise turned to leave, she didn't slouch or hurry away like most defendants. She walked with the same dignity with which she had entered, pausing only to help an elderly woman who had dropped her purse near the courtroom door. Something about that simple act of kindness made Judge Whitman pause as she was writing in her case notes. She glanced up to see Denise exit the courtroom, surrounded by several people who had waited for her, all of them speaking in hushed, supportive tones. For the first time in years, Judge Whitman felt a slight crack in her certainty, but she quickly dismissed the feeling, turning to the next case file. She had a job to do, and she would do it as she always had, without emotion, without exception, and without doubt. Little did she know that her encounter with Denise Robinson was far from over, and that the real story was just beginning to unfold. The next 24 hours would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, fairness, and the true meaning of serving the community. Judge Sarah Whitman arrived at the courthouse at precisely 8:15 a.m., just as she had done every weekday for the past 15 years. The morning sun reflected off her silver Mercedes as she pulled into her reserved parking spot. The words, "Chief Municipal Judge," freshly painted on the concrete barrier in front of her car. She smoothed her perfectly pressed black robe as she walked through the employee entrance, returning curt nods to the security guards who had long since learned that their cheerful good mornings would be met with little enthusiasm. Her heels clicked against the marble floor echoing through the still quiet hallway of the Harrison County Courthouse. "Morning, Your Honor." Her clerk, Thomas, greeted her with a stack of files already in his hands. "You have 27 cases on the docket today, mostly traffic violations and minor infractions." Sarah nodded, taking the files without looking up. "Any that require special attention?" she asked, already knowing the answer. In her courtroom, every case received the same treatment. By the book, no exceptions. The judge's office was exactly as she liked it, immaculate. The law degrees and certificates hanging on the walls were perfectly aligned. The desktop was clear except for her laptop and a single leather-bound notepad, and even the plants by the window seemed to grow in an orderly fashion. She had cultivated this environment of strict order just as carefully as she had cultivated her reputation. As she reviewed the day's cases, Sarah's mind wandered to the latest article in the local newspaper praising her efficient courtroom. The journalist had called her firm but fair, though the whispers in the courthouse hallways often used different words. Cold, mechanical, unforgiving. Such criticisms didn't bother her. The law was the law, and someone had to enforce it without being swayed by emotional appeals or sob stories. Thomas knocked on her door at 9:45 a.m., right on schedule. "Courtroom is ready, Your Honor. First case in 15 minutes." Sarah gathered her materials and made her final preparations. She checked her appearance in the small mirror behind her door. Her gray-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, her reading glasses were spotless, and her expression was set in its usual mask of stern authority. The walk to her courtroom was like a carefully choreographed dance she had performed thousands of times. 3 steps down the hall, turn right, 20 steps to the private entrance. Pause for exactly 5 seconds, then enter as the bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Sarah Whitman presiding. The familiar scene unfolded before her. Nervous defendants shifting in their seats, attorneys shuffling papers, the court reporter positioning her fingers over her stenotype machine. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. "Be seated," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority she had perfected over the years. She looked down at her docket, already knowing what to expect, the usual parade of excuses, pleas for leniency, and promises to do better. What Sarah didn't expect was the last case file Thomas had slipped into her stack. It was thicker than usual for a traffic violation, with several notes paper-clipped to the front. The defendant's name was Denise Robinson, and something about the photograph attached to the file made Sarah pause for just a fraction of a second. The woman in the photo had a dignity about her that seemed out of place in a standard mugshot. Her eyes held something that Sarah couldn't quite identify, not defiance, not fear, but something else entirely. Sarah quickly pushed the thought aside. A traffic violation was a traffic violation, regardless of who committed it or what they looked like. "First case," she announced, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. As the first defendant approached the bench, Sarah settled into her routine, her mind already categorizing violations and calculating fines with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Little did Judge Sarah Whitman know that by the end of this particular day, her carefully constructed world of black and white justice would be challenged in ways she never expected. The last case on her docket, that of Denise Robinson, would force her to confront not just her approach to justice, but her understanding of humanity itself. The morning session began, and with each bang of her gavel, Sarah moved one case closer to the encounter that would change everything. That evening, Judge Sarah Whitman sat in the back row of the City Council chambers, attending the monthly public meeting as she always did. She liked to stay informed about local politics, though she rarely participated. The chamber was fuller than usual, with every seat taken and people standing along the walls. Council President Matthews was discussing the usual agenda items: budget reports, zoning requests, and local ordinances. Sarah checked her phone, already thinking about the cases she would hear tomorrow. But then a familiar voice caught her attention. "Next speaker is Denise Robinson, representing the Community Bridge Initiative," announced Matthews. Sarah's head snapped up. Walking to the podium was the same woman she had found just hours earlier, but something was different. Denise wasn't alone. Behind her stood a group of people wearing blue T-shirts with CBI printed on them. "Thank you, council members," Denise began, her voice clear and confident. "I'm here to present our quarterly report on the Community Bridge Initiative's impact on Harrison County." Sarah watched, incredulous, as Denise clicked through a professional presentation. Graphs and charts appeared on the large screen, showing statistics that made several council members lean forward with interest. In the past 3 months alone, our food bank has served over 2,000 families, Denise continued. Our job training program has helped 150 people find stable employment, and our youth mentorship program has seen a 40% increase in high school graduation rates among participants. Photographs flashed across the screen. Denise organizing food drives, speaking at schools, meeting with business leaders. In each image, she radiated the same quiet dignity Sarah had witnessed in her courtroom. But today, I need to address a serious concern, Denise said, her tone growing more serious. Our emergency response fund, which helps families during unexpected crises, is running low. 3 months ago, we had to make a difficult choice. A family of 4 lost everything in a house fire, and they needed immediate assistance for temporary housing and basic necessities. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. 3 months ago, the same time as the unpaid traffic ticket. We had to decide between paying some of our scheduled obligations or helping this family avoid homelessness, Denise explained, her eyes scanning the room. We chose the family. We always will choose helping people in crisis. But these choices come with consequences, and we need the council's support to establish a more sustainable funding model. Council members were nodding, jotting down notes. President Matthews leaned into his microphone. Ms. Robinson, your organization's work is remarkable. Can you tell us how many volunteers you currently coordinate? We have over 200 active volunteers, Denise replied. Many of them are former recipients of our services who now give back to the community. Last month alone, they contributed more than 3,000 hours of service. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing. The woman she had dismissed as just another defendant trying to avoid responsibility was actually a community leader whose work touched thousands of lives. The $500 contempt fine she had imposed could have helped multiple families in need. As Denise concluded her presentation, several council members stood to applaud. People wearing the CBI shirts hugged her, and a line formed of citizens wanting to speak with her. Sarah slipped out of the chamber before anyone could notice her. In her car, she sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. She pulled out her phone and searched for Community Bridge Initiative. The organization's website appeared, filled with news articles about their work. There was Denise again, receiving a humanitarian award last year. Another photo showed her standing with the governor, being recognized for innovative community outreach programs. The reality of what had happened in her courtroom today hit Sarah with full force. She had treated a dedicated community servant like a common scofflaw. Worse, her harsh fine would directly impact people in desperate need of help. For the first time in her career, Judge Sarah Whitman felt the weight of her power from a different perspective. She had always believed that strict adherence to the law meant justice was being served. But now, sitting alone in the darkening parking lot, she wasn't so sure. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about tomorrow's court schedule, but Sarah barely noticed it. Her mind was already racing with questions she had never allowed herself to consider before. Questions about justice, mercy, and what it truly means to serve the law while serving the community. Judge Whitman couldn't sleep that night. At 3 a.m., she sat in her home office, surrounded by printouts about the Community Bridge Initiative. Her usual neat desktop was covered with newspapers, reports, and community bulletins, all featuring Denise Robinson's work. The more she read, the more her stomach twisted. Last month's local paper had a front-page story about CBI's emergency response to a devastating apartment fire. The organization had housed 15 displaced families in temporary accommodations while helping them find permanent homes. The money that should have paid the traffic fine had gone to buying clothes and school supplies for children who had lost everything. Sarah clicked through old court records, examining cases she had handled over the past year. How many other Denise Robinsons had stood before her? How many other stories had she dismissed with her quick gavel and rigid rules? At 7 a.m., she arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. Thomas, she called to her clerk, who was just settling at his desk. I need you to pull everything we have on community service organizations in Harrison County and get me the contact information for every judge in the state who has implemented alternative sentencing programs. Thomas blinked in surprise but nodded. In 15 years, he had never seen Judge Whitman like this. By mid-morning, her desk was covered with even more papers. She learned that Denise had started CBI 10 years ago after losing her own home in a financial crisis. Instead of giving up, she had turned her experience into a mission to help others. The organization had grown from a small food pantry in her garage to a comprehensive support system that city officials now relied on during community emergencies. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read about CBI's latest initiative, a program helping single mothers pay traffic fines and court fees while attending financial literacy classes. The irony wasn't lost on her. A knock on her door interrupted her research. "Your Honor," Thomas said hesitantly, "I have those files you requested about alternative sentencing. But your first case is scheduled in 10 minutes. Sarah looked at the clock, then at the mess of papers on her desk. For the first time in her career, the thought of going to court filled her with uncertainty. "Thomas," she said quietly, "how long have you worked with me?" 12 years, Your Honor. "And in all that time, have you ever disagreed with one of my rulings?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "It's not my place to." "Please," Sarah interrupted. "I need to know." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he finally admitted. "Sometimes I thought. Sometimes the fines seemed to hurt people who were already hurting. But you always said the law is the law." Sarah nodded slowly. "The law is the law," she repeated. "But maybe I've been interpreting it too narrowly." She picked up a photograph from her desk. Denise Robinson surrounded by smiling volunteers at a community event. Maybe true justice needs both rules and understanding. She stood up, straightening her robe. "Cancel my morning sessions," she announced. "I need to visit somewhere." 30 minutes later, Sarah parked her Mercedes in front of a modest building with Community Bridge Initiative painted on the window. Through the glass, she could see people lining up at what appeared to be a food distribution center. Volunteers in blue shirts moved efficiently, helping elderly residents carry bags and entertaining children while their parents filled out forms. Sarah sat in her car, watching. A young woman emerged from the building, crying and hugging Denise. Even from a distance, Sarah could read the relief on the woman's face. Whatever crisis had brought her here, she had found help. The judge thought about the $950 in fines she had imposed yesterday. How many meals could that money provide? How many families could it help? For the first time, she understood that her definition of justice had been too simple, too rigid, too blind to the complex realities of people's lives. She reached for her phone, then stopped. What could she possibly say to Denise? "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate. "I was wrong" felt incomplete. She needed to do more than apologize. She needed to change. Sarah started her car, her mind made up. She would begin by understanding more about her community, about the people who appeared in her courtroom, about the thin line between enforcing the law and serving justice. And she would start right now. What she didn't know was that her journey of understanding was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge her even more deeply than she imagined. The following week found Judge Whitman sitting quietly in the back row of a community center meeting room. She had traded her judicial robes for a simple blouse and slacks, hoping to blend in with the crowd. The room was packed with people attending CBI's monthly community forum. Denise Robinson hadn't noticed her yet. She was too busy coordinating with volunteers, checking microphones, and greeting people by name as they entered. Sarah watched as Denise stopped to hug an elderly woman, then knelt to speak with a child clutching a worn backpack. "First time here." Sarah turned to find a middle-aged man smiling at her. His name tag read, "Marcus, CBI volunteer." "Yes," she replied softly. "I'm just observing." "Best place to learn about real life in Harrison County," Marcus said. "See that lady over there?" He pointed to a woman setting up chairs. 6 months ago, she was living in her car with 2 kids. Now she has a job, an apartment, and volunteers here every week. Sarah felt her throat tighten. That woman had appeared in her courtroom last year for a parking violation. She remembered dismissing her explanation about living in her vehicle, adding late fees to her fine. The meeting began with community members sharing their stories. A young man spoke about how CBI's job training program had helped him after prison. A single mother described how the emergency fund had kept her family housed when medical bills threatened eviction. Each story hit Sarah like a physical blow. These were the same people she saw in court, the ones whose explanations she had cut short. Then Denise took the microphone. Today, we need to discuss a challenge, she began. Our emergency response fund is running low. The recent increase in court fines has affected many families we serve, forcing them to choose between paying legal obligations and meeting basic needs. Sarah sank lower in her seat, her face burning. But we don't give up, Denise continued. We're starting a new program to help people navigate the legal system, understand their rights, and find ways to meet their obligations without sacrificing their family's well-being. After the meeting, Sarah lingered, watching Denise interact with community members. She solved problems with quiet efficiency, connecting one person with job resources, another with legal aid, writing down names and numbers, making calls on the spot. Judge Whitman. Sarah froze. A young volunteer had recognized her. Heads turned. Whispers spread through the room. Denise looked up from her conversation, her eyes meeting Sarah's across the space. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Denise excused herself from her group and walked over. The room grew quiet, watching this unexpected confrontation. Your Honor, Denise said calmly, I wasn't expecting to see you here. Sarah straightened her shoulders. Ms. Robinson, I've been learning about your organization, about the work you do. And what have you learned? Denise's tone was neither hostile nor friendly. I've learned that I've been wrong, Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly. Not about the law, but about how it should be applied. I've been seeing rules instead of people. Denise studied her for a long moment. Would you like a tour of our facility? She finally asked. For the next hour, Denise showed Sarah around the building. She saw the food pantry, the classroom where GED classes were held, the child care center for working parents. Each room held stories of lives being rebuilt, of community being strengthened. Why didn't you tell me any of this in court? Sarah asked as they stood in the computer lab where job seekers worked on resumes. Would you have listened? Denise replied quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Sarah remembered her sharp interruptions, her impatient dismissals. No, she admitted. I wouldn't have, but I'm listening now. Denise nodded slowly. That's a start. But Judge Whitman, listening isn't enough. Our community needs change, real change. Sarah looked around the room, at the people working hard to improve their lives despite overwhelming obstacles. Some of those obstacles, she now realized, had been placed there by people like her, people who enforced rules without understanding their impact. You're right, she said. And I think I know where that change needs to begin. What Sarah didn't realize was that her next decision would not only transform her courtroom, but would spark a controversy that would test her newfound understanding in ways she never expected. The next morning, Judge Whitman arrived at the courthouse with a determined expression. Instead of heading straight to her chambers, she stopped at every clerk's desk, every office, gathering information she had never bothered to seek before. How many people request payment plans for their fines? She asked one clerk. At least 15 a day, Your Honor, the clerk replied, surprised by the judge's interest. Most get denied because they don't meet the strict criteria. In another office, she learned that nearly 30% of fine payments went to collection agencies, often doubling or tripling the original amounts. The numbers painted a disturbing picture of a system that trapped people in cycles of debt. During her lunch break, instead of eating in her office as usual, Sarah drove to different neighborhoods in Harrison County. She saw the contrast between the manicured lawns near her home and the struggling areas where many of her defendants lived. She passed the apartment complex that had burned down, the one where CBI had helped families recover. When she returned to court that afternoon, something had changed in her demeanor. The usual stern mask was gone, replaced by an attentive expression that made defendants pause in surprise. Your Honor, Thomas whispered before the session began, there's quite a crowd today. Sarah nodded. Word had spread about her visit to CBI, and the gallery was packed with community members, curious to see if the Iron Judge had really changed. The first case was a young man charged with driving with an expired license. Before we proceed, Sarah said, departing from her usual script, I'd like to understand your situation. What prevented you from renewing your license? The man blinked, clearly prepared for immediate punishment rather than questions. I couldn't take time off work, Your Honor. I'm the only one supporting my mother since her stroke, and the DMV is only open during my work hours. In the past, Sarah would have cut him off. Instead, she asked more questions. She learned that he worked 2 jobs, that his mother needed expensive medication, that he had been trying to save enough to take a day off for the renewal. The law requires a fine for driving with an expired license, she finally said. However, the court will allow you to pay it through community service hours. Additionally, I'm going to contact the DMV about implementing evening hours for license renewals. A murmur ran through the courtroom. By the end of the afternoon, Sarah had handled each case with the same careful attention, looking for ways to uphold the law while acknowledging human circumstances. After court adjourned, she found Denise waiting in her office. "Your clerk called me," Denise explained. "He said you wanted to discuss setting up a community service program." Sarah gestured for her to sit. "Yes, but first, I want to address your contempt fine." She pulled out an official document. "I'm vacating it. The original traffic fine can be paid through community service hours, though I suspect you've done more than enough service to cover it already." Denise smiled slightly, but didn't interrupt. "However," Sarah continued, "that's just the beginning. I want to establish a proper community service program, one that allows people to pay their fines through meaningful work that benefits everyone. I need your help to do it right." "It won't be easy," Denise warned. "You'll face resistance from people who prefer the old way." "I know." Sarah straightened in her chair. "But I've seen enough to know the old way isn't working. We need a system that upholds the law while recognizing human dignity." They spent the next 2 hours outlining ideas. When Denise finally left, Sarah sat alone in her office, looking at the law degrees on her wall. They seemed different now, not just symbols of authority, but reminders of her responsibility to serve justice in its truest form. Her phone buzzed with a message from the court administrator. Several other judges wanted to meet with her about her unconventional new approaches. Some were curious, others concerned. Sarah knew the real challenges were just beginning. But as she gathered her things to leave, she felt more certain of her path than she had in years. The law hadn't changed, but her understanding of how to apply it had evolved in ways she never expected. What she didn't know was that her biggest test was still to come, one that would force her to choose between her newfound principles and her entire career. 2 months after Judge Whitman's visit to CBI, her courtroom had transformed. Gone was the tense atmosphere of fear. Instead, defendants found themselves before a judge who listened first and judged second. The change hadn't gone unnoticed or unchallenged. On this particular morning, Sarah sat in the chief judge's office, facing 3 stern-faced members of the Judicial Review Board. "Judge Whitman," the chief judge began, "we've received numerous complaints about your unconventional methods. Your conviction rates are down 40%, and fine collections have dropped significantly." "But repeat offender rates have also dropped," Sarah countered, pulling out a detailed report. "And our new community service program has contributed over 5,000 hours of work to public projects." "That's not the point," another board member interrupted. "You're setting a dangerous precedent. Other judges are feeling pressured to adopt similar practices. The entire system could be undermined." Sarah took a deep breath. "With respect, maybe the system needs undermining. I've seen firsthand how. We've also received reports about your personal involvement with the Community Bridge Initiative." The chief judge cut in. "There are concerns about your objectivity." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Emergency in courtroom. Need you immediately." "We're not finished," the chief judge warned as Sarah stood. "No, we're not," she agreed, heading for the door. "But justice can't wait." She rushed to her courtroom, finding it packed beyond capacity. At the defendant's table stood Maria Santos, a young mother she recognized from CBI's child care center. Maria's face was tear-stained, her hands trembling. "Your Honor," Thomas explained quietly, "Ms. Santos was caught taking food from a grocery store. Store owner is pressing charges. But there's more." Sarah listened as the story unfolded. Maria had lost her job when the factory closed. Despite help from CBI, she'd struggled to feed her 3 children. The day she was caught, her youngest had been sick, needing medicine she couldn't afford. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, stood angrily before the bench. "She's a thief, plain and simple. I want her prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Sarah noticed Denise Robinson sitting quietly in the gallery, watching. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw both challenge and trust in Denise's gaze. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah began, "what is the value of the items taken?" $67.42, he replied firmly. "And how long have you owned your store in this community?" 20 years, and never had problems until recently." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "In those 20 years, has your store ever benefited from community support? Perhaps from loyal customers during hard times, or neighborhood watch programs keeping your property safe?" Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, but—" "Ms. Santos broke the law," Sarah acknowledged. "That's not in dispute. But as a community, we have choices in how we respond to desperation." She turned to Maria. "The law requires consequences for theft. However, those consequences can serve both justice and community healing." Sarah outlined her decision. Maria would work at the store for 2 months, helping with inventory and stocking. Her children could stay at CBI's childcare center during her shifts. The store would donate expired but edible food to CBI's food bank instead of throwing it away. This way, Sarah concluded, we turn a moment of desperation into an opportunity for community building. Mr. Peterson's anger had faded, replaced by thoughtful consideration. Maria was crying again, but now with relief. As the courtroom cleared, Sarah noticed the Judicial Review Board members standing in the back. They had witnessed everything. The chief judge approached her bench. "That was quite a performance," he said quietly. "That was justice," Sarah replied. "Real justice, served with both law and humanity. The board will need to continue our discussion about your methods." "I look forward to it," Sarah said firmly, "because I have reports, data, and dozens of success stories to share. What I'm doing here isn't undermining the system, it's evolving it." After everyone left, Sarah sat alone in her courtroom. She thought about how far she had come from the judge who had once fined Denise Robinson without a second thought. That day had changed everything, her perspective, her understanding of justice, and most importantly, her understanding of her true role as a judge. But as she would soon discover, her boldest and most challenging decision still lay ahead. One that would test not just her new principles, but the entire legal system itself. 6 months after Judge Whitman's first visit to CBI, she stood before the state judicial conference. Hundreds of judges from across the state filled the auditorium, along with legal scholars, community leaders, and media representatives. At her side stood Denise Robinson. "My fellow judges," Sarah began, her voice steady. "6 months ago, I was known as the Iron Judge. I took pride in that title, believing that strict enforcement of the law meant justice was being served. I was wrong." She clicked through slides showing the results of her reformed courtroom approach. The statistics were compelling: reduced recidivism, increased fine collection through community service, and stronger community engagement in the legal system. "But numbers tell only part of the story," Sarah continued. "The real change can be seen in the faces of people who now leave our courtroom with their dignity intact and a path forward." The presentation screen showed Maria Santos, now a full-time employee at Peterson's grocery store. Mr. Peterson himself had become a regular donor to CBI's food bank. Image after image showed similar successes, people who had found redemption instead of punishment. "Today," Sarah announced, "I'm proposing a complete overhaul of our municipal court system. Working with the Community Bridge Initiative, we've developed a model that balances accountability with opportunity." The proposal was bold. Mandatory community impact assessments before sentencing, expanded community service options, collaboration with local organizations, and evening court sessions for working people. Most controversially, she proposed that judges should be required to spend time each month in the communities they served. As Sarah concluded, the room erupted in chaos. Some judges stood applauding, while others voiced loud objections. The chief judge looked like he had swallowed something sour. Then Denise stepped forward. The room quieted. 6 months ago, I stood in Judge Whitman's courtroom, facing punitive fines that would have crippled our organization's ability to help others, she began. Today, I stand here as her partner in reform. The judge who once silenced me now amplifies the voices of our community. The chief judge raised his hand. And what of the law? Should we simply ignore violations because people have sad stories? No, Sarah replied firmly. We uphold the law, but we do it with wisdom and understanding. Justice without compassion isn't justice at all, it's just punishment. She turned to face her colleagues directly. I'm not asking you to be soft on crime. I'm asking you to be smart about justice. The debate lasted hours. By the end, the conference had voted to implement a pilot program based on Sarah's model in select courts across the state. It wasn't complete victory, but it was a start. As people filed out, the chief judge approached Sarah and Denise. You've started something here, he said gravely. I'm not sure if it's a revolution or a disaster. Sarah smiled. Come visit my courtroom, sir. See for yourself. Later that evening, Sarah and Denise stood outside the conference center. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Did you ever imagine this? Denise asked. That day in court when you find me. Sarah shook her head. I was so certain then, certain about right and wrong, about justice, about my role. You changed everything. No, Denise corrected gently. You changed everything. You had the courage to question your own beliefs, to listen, to learn. That's rarer than you think. As they parted ways, Sarah remembered something her law professor had once said. The law is a living thing. It grows and evolves with the society it serves. The next morning, Judge Sarah Whitman returned to her courtroom. The day's docket was full, but she no longer saw case numbers and violations. She saw people, stories, and possibilities. Thomas handed her the first file of the day. Ready, Your Honor. Sarah nodded, thinking of how far she had come from the iron judge she used to be. She had learned that true justice required not just knowledge of the law, but understanding of humanity. It required both strength and compassion, both rules and wisdom. Yes, she said, opening the file. Let's serve justice, real justice. As she called the first case, Sarah knew that her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. But now she had something she never had before, a clear vision of what justice could truly be, and the courage to make it reality. The iron judge was gone. In her place sat someone far stronger, a judge who had learned that the greatest power lies not in enforcing the law, but in using it to lift up the community she served.